When a man is young, the market can frighten him and still forgive him. That is one of the privileges of youth at 35. You can make a foolish allocation, sit through a terrible decade recover, and still have working years ahead of you to repair the damage. At 45, the same is often true, though less comfortably. At 55, the margin narrows. By 70, the mathematics of error change completely. That is the part most people never fully understand. They carry the instincts that served them in their 40s and 50s into their 70s, and then act surprised when the same habits become dangerous. They say to themselves that they always owned a lot of stocks, always stayed aggressive, always reached for yield, always trusted the market to recover, and always believed that more return was worth a little extra risk. They mistake familiarity for suitability. They assume what once worked must still be wise. It is not. If I were 70 today and my task was no longer to build an empire but to protect a lifetime of effort, I would think about money very differently than I did at 50. I would not think first about maximizing upside. I would think about permanence. I would not think first about outperforming anybody. I would think about not becoming vulnerable. I would not think first about what sounds exciting in a newsletter or a sales presentation. I would think about what I can count on when life stops caring, whether the market is having a good year. That is what age does to the investing problem. It changes the question. The younger investor asks, how much can this grow? The older investor must ask, how much of this can fail without damaging the life I have left? That is a much more serious question. I have watched this pattern for decades. People who were sensible, disciplined, and even highly successful in their working years arrive at retirement with good money and bad instincts. They still think like accumulators when they should be thinking like custodians. They still think about return like a score when they should be thinking about safety like a structure. They still let advisors talk them into complexity because complexity flatters the ego. They still let the market convince them that risk is acceptable because risk had not yet punished them in the years when they still had time to recover. That is how people lose peace in the exact season when peace should become the primary objective. The financial industry makes this worse because it uses the word safe the way advertisers use the word natural. It is a word emptied of discipline and filled back up with marketing. People are told that a high-yield bond fund is safe because it pays monthly. They are told an annuity is safe because an insurance company wrapped it in a guarantee. They are told dividend stocks are safe because mature businesses write checks. They are told balanced portfolios are safe because the chart looks diversified and the pie graph is colorful. Most of this language is lazy at best and predatory at worst. A thing is not safe because the salesman lowers his voice when he says the word a thing is safe, only if it survives the actual test. And when I say safe for someone over 70, I mean something precise. I mean, first, that principal should not be meaningfully at risk. I mean, second, that the income promise should arrive without theatrical surprises. I mean, third, that the money should be available when life demands it, not when the product finally decides you have waited long enough. That is my test. Most products fail at least one of those conditions. Many fail two. Some fail all three while wearing a respectable suit. That is why this discussion matters. People over 70 do not need more stories. They need fewer illusions. Let me make it personal. Some years ago, I knew a man I will call Harold. He did what the culture told him to do. He worked hard, saved over a lifetime, and by the time he retired had about $2.3 million. That is enough money that a younger person might look at it and think the game is over, that the hard part is finished, that security is automatic. Now, security is never automatic. Harold's advisor told him that at his age he still needed plenty of growth. The advisor called the allocation balanced. That word should always make you suspicious because it is one of those wonderfully vague expressions that sounds prudent without telling you anything useful. In Harold's case, balanced meant roughly 60% stocks. That may have sounded respectable in a sales meeting. Then 2008 arrived, his portfolio fell by more than 40%. His $2.3 million became roughly $1.4 million. Now here is the part young people do not understand. A 40% loss at 35 is painful. A 40% loss at 72 is something else entirely. At 35, you still have salary time and emotional elasticity. At 72, your daily life may now depend on a capital base that just took a blow so severe it may not recover in your lifetime. Unless you cut spending, keep taking risk, or both. Harold panicked. Of course he panicked. He was not weak. He was in a structurally indefensible position. He sold near the bottom because the pain became psychologically greater than the theory. Then the market recovered, as it often does, but Harold did not recover with it. He had moved to cash after the damage and then spent the rest of his life with the kind of anxiety I would not wish on anybody. He had started retirement as a millionaire and spent the end of it acting like a man waiting for the floor to fall out again. People like Harold are not rare. They are the silent class of retirement casualties produced by an industry that keeps selling growth to people who should be buying resilience. I received letters for years from people living some version of that same story. A woman named Eleanor once wrote to me after the financial crisis about how she and her husband had retired with around $1.8 million, believed themselves safe, and then watched a stock-heavy portfolio take losses so severe that the money and the emotional damage became inseparable. Her husband, a good engineer who had spent a lifetime building a responsible life, could not process the collapse. He became depressed, his health deteriorated. She believed the financial stress helped kill him. Whether every detail of cause and effect can be proven is not even the main point. The main point is that volatility in old age is not an abstraction. It does not live in a spreadsheet. It enters the house, it enters the marriage, it enters the bloodstream, it changes what people eat, where they go, what they postpone, which grandchildren they visit less often, whether they refill the prescription now or next month, whether they still believe they can afford to live in their own home. That is why I have become increasingly intolerant of loose language around safety. At 70, the right portfolio is not the one that maximizes theoretical return under favorable assumptions. It is the one that protects dignity under unfavorable ones. Once you define the problem that way, the universe of genuinely safe investments becomes much smaller than most people think. I would narrow it to 3 categories. Not because they are glamorous, because they pass the test. The first is short-term United States Treasury securities. The second is a low-cost SP 500 index fund used in the right proportion and with a right time horizon. The third is cash held properly, either inside FDIC protected structures or Treasury, only money market vehicles. That is it. People always expect something more sophisticated. They think if the answer is too simple, then surely it cannot be complete. The financial world has trained them to distrust simplicity because simplicity threatens margins. Complexity is a much better product if you are trying to charge fees, but if you are trying to protect a 70-year-old from preventable financial stress, simplicity is not a weakness. It is the entire point. Let me begin with short-term treasuries because this is the clearest category in the world. If you buy a short-term U.S. Treasury bill or a short-term Treasury note, you are lending money directly to the United States government for a short period. That matters because the U.S. government has 2 powers almost no other borrower has in quite the same way. It can tax and it issues debt in a currency it controls. That does not make every long-term fiscal question irrelevant, but it does make the question of short-term nominal repayment about as secure as the modern financial world gets. People love discussing the national debt in giant frightening numbers, and giant frightening numbers do deserve respect. But there is a difference between long-term inflationary erosion and short-term nominal default. For someone over 70 thinking about where to place safe money over the next 6 months, 12 months, or perhaps 3 years, those are very different problems. The relevant question is not whether America has abstract debt issues 50 years from now. The relevant question is whether the United States will pay a Treasury bill maturing in a year. I regard that as close to certain as any financial promise available, and history supports that view through wars, depressions, inflation, disinflation, elections, recessions, political stupidity, banking crises, and every other American drama you can name. Treasury holders have been paid. That consistency matters because retirement safety is not built from enthusiasm, it is built from reliability. Now, I am emphasizing short-term treasuries for a reason. People hear Treasury and think all government bonds are equally safe in every practical sense. That is not true. Long-term Treasury bonds can lose substantial market value when interest rates rise. We saw that very clearly in 2022. A 30-year Treasury can absolutely punish its holder in mark to market terms if rates move against it. For a young institution that can hold through the cycle, that may be tolerable. For a 75-year-old who thought government bonds meant no losses, that can be a nasty surprise. Short-term Treasuries solve most of that problem. If your instrument matures in a few months or within a couple of years, interest rate sensitivity becomes much smaller. You know what you will receive, and you receive it relatively soon. You are not placing a giant bet on the future path of rates. You are renting out cash briefly to the strongest nominal borrower in the system. That is how I want a retiree to think about the foundation of the portfolio, not heroic, foundational. And right now, or at least in the kind of environment described by your source material, short-term Treasury yields are not insulting. They sit in the general area of 4 to 5%. That means for the first time in many years, retirees can earn meaningful income from genuinely safe short-duration assets without having to pretend junk is safety or complexity is prudence. That matters enormously. If a person has $1 million and can earn around $40,000 to $50,000 annually from short-term Treasury exposure with very little principal risk and excellent liquidity, that changes the whole emotional architecture of retirement. It means some portion of spending can be met without gambling. It means the person does not have to stare at the stock market every day and pray. It means the market stops being a tyrant and becomes once again just a tool. That is one reason I would place a very substantial share of a post-70 portfolio here, at least half, perhaps more, depending on temperament, outside income sources, and how much of life is already funded elsewhere. If Social Security is generous enough relative to spending, the Treasury allocation might be smaller. If the person is nervous or frail or simply values certainty very highly, it might be larger. But this is where the bedrock belongs. I also like the practical mechanics. Treasury bills can be bought directly. They can be laddered so maturities come due in intervals. That creates both income and optionality. Every few months, a piece of the capital returns to you. You can spend it, roll it, or redeploy it. A laddered system is elegant precisely because it is unexciting. It keeps the investor from making giant all or nothing timing decisions. I admire that. The second category is where people often become confused. So let me say it carefully. A low-cost S&P 500 index fund can be safe for someone over 70, but only if it is used for the portion of money that truly has a long enough time horizon, and only if the owner has the temperament not to sabotage it. That last point is non-negotiable. Stocks are not safe in the short run. Anyone telling you otherwise is either inexperienced or selling something. The market can fall 30 or 50%. It has done so before, and it will do so again. If a 70-year-old puts needed living expenses in the stock market and expects safety because the fund is broad and reputable, that is a category error. But if a 70-year-old is healthy, may well live another 15 to 20 years, and has separated near-term spending money from long-term capital, then owning productive American businesses through a low-cost broad index fund is not reckless at all. In fact, it may be one of the sanest ways to protect purchasing power over the later decades of life. That is because inflation is not hypothetical either. People worry so much about losing money visibly that they forget money can be lost invisibly. If you hold everything in instruments that feel safe nominally, but do not grow enough over time, inflation can slowly hollow out the real value of your life. Healthcare gets dearer, property taxes rise, home maintenance rises, food rises, assistance rises. Life does not stay still. You need some growth. The mistake is not growth itself. The mistake is demanding too much of it from the wrong portion of the portfolio. A low-cost S&P 500 index fund gives you something no individual stock ever can: diversified participation in the long-run earnings power of large American business without requiring you to guess which specific company will dominate the next decade. You get turnover automatically. Winners rise into the index. Losers decline out of relevance. The machine adapts. That is what I like about index ownership for ordinary investors. Not because it is flashy, because it is honest. A great many older investors are seduced into individual stock risk by the idea that dividend history equals safety or that familiar brand names cannot disappoint them. I have seen people over-concentrate in old utility names, old telecom names, regional banks, favorite consumer brands, or whatever else made them feel they knew the company. Then trouble came, and their confidence turned out to be familiarity wearing the costume of analysis. I would rather most retirees who want equity exposure own the broad index cheaply and leave it alone. Costs matter here too. A low-cost S&P 500 fund may charge almost nothing. That is a gift. High fees are especially poisonous in retirement because the drag compounds while your ability to replenish capital declines. Why pay an active manager generously to underperform when broad market ownership is available at a cost so low it feels almost rude to the old mutual fund industry? Still, the key question is not whether the index fund is a good product. It is whether the owner has structured life so that he will not need to sell it during the wrong decade. That is why I said at the start that safety after 70 is about structure. The same asset can be safe or unsafe depending on the job you assign it. If the SP 500 sleeve is for money not needed for at least 10 years, it can serve beautifully. If it is for next year, S roof. Next month, S medical event, or next quarter, S living expenses, then it is not safe at all. And temperament matters just as much as time horizon. I have known people who can hold through a brutal bear market because they understand what they own and why they own it. I have known others who call themselves long-term investors until the market drops 20%, at which point they become emergency liquidators. If you know you are the second person, you must admit that, honestly, there is no shame in self-knowledge. There is enormous shame in self-deception. The third category is cash. Now here again I expect resistance because younger investors have been trained to sneer at cash. They say cash is trash, that idle money is wasting away, that inflation eats it, that being fully invested is intelligent, and being liquid is timid. Young men say many things that sound bold and expensive. By 70, you learn to respect liquidity. Cash is not there to make you rich. It is there to keep you civilized. That may be the best way I know to put it. A retiree with 1 or 2 years of actual spending needs available in highly liquid, safe cash or treasury money market. Like structures, is in a very different emotional position from a retiree who must sell something every time life surprises him. The latter is always exposed to timing, the former is protected from it. That difference is priceless. A roof leak, a sudden trip, a family emergency, a dental bill, a legal nuisance, help for a grandchild, a car replacement, a home health expense, a tax surprise. Life keeps inventing ways to ask for money. A person over 70 should not be forced to consult the market every time life knocks on the door. That is what cash solves, not growth friction, and it solves psychological friction as well. When a market crash hits, the retiree with a real cash reserve can leave the stock sleeve alone. He can let the treasury ladder keep functioning. He can spend from cash while letting risk assets recover. He can think the retiree without cash becomes vulnerable to exactly the sequence I hate. He sees stocks fall, he needs money, he sells low quality things first, then perhaps higher quality things, then perhaps everything. He is not choosing rationally, he is reacting structurally to a bad setup. That is why I insist cash belongs in the portfolio, not as a symbol of fear, but as a form of freedom. Now, cash should be held intelligently. I do not want large uninsured piles sitting lazily in one bank earning next to nothing, because the owner never bothered to move them. FDIC limits are real. Spread the deposits if necessary. Use treasury money market funds where appropriate. Use high yield savings vehicles if the rates are competitive and the structure is sound. Do not let convenience become leakage. This is another pattern I have seen repeatedly. People will spend days researching stocks and leave hundreds of thousands of dollars languishing at nearly zero because the bank branch is familiar. Familiarity is one of the most expensive emotional habits in finance. The right amount of cash depends on spending, health, and overall balance sheet confidence. But the principle is constant. Keep enough liquid money so that ordinary life cannot force you into extraordinary stupidity. If you put these three pieces together properly, something very attractive happens. The short-term treasuries, fund stability, and a large share of income. The SP 500 sleeve protects long-run purchasing power and gives the later decades of life a growth engine. The cash reserve absorbs shocks and preserves behavioral control. That is a real retirement structure. And notice what is missing. No heroic yield chase. No opaque annuity contracts with surrender schedules hidden in the fine print. No junk. Bond reach for income. No overconcentration in favorite dividend names. No private credit fantasies sold as enhanced cash. No elegant sounding complexity that mostly exists to justify fees. Just three categories, each assigned a clear job. That is what I mean by safe. It is not about finding one magical instrument. It is about making sure every dollar has a role appropriate to the life stage. Now let me make this even more concrete. Suppose a person has $1 million and a spending pattern that suggests real caution is appropriate. You might imagine something like $550,000 in short-term treasuries, $300,000 in a low-cost SP 500 index fund, and $150,000 in cash or cash equivalents. That is not sacred. It is illustrative. What matters is the logic. More than half the capital is protected and producing steady income. A meaningful slice still participates in long-run business growth. A cash reserve sits ready for life. If the person has strong pension income and modest expenses, perhaps the stock slice grows a bit. If expenses are high and nerves are weak, perhaps the Treasury and cash pieces dominate more heavily. Fine, the structure should adapt to the person, not to some model portfolio from a brochure. And please notice the deeper shift here at 70, you do not need to get rich again. That sentence should be framed. You only need enough. You need enough income that ordinary life feels funded, enough safety that a bad year in markets does not enter your bloodstream, enough liquidity that you can respond to life with grace, enough growth that inflation does not slowly humiliate you. That is all the culture keeps telling older investors. They should still seek more yield, more upside, more optimization, more product features, more strategy, more sophistication. But when I look around, the happiest retirees are not usually the ones still chasing the hardest. They are the ones worrying the least. They are the ones whose money no longer demands attention every morning. They are the ones who do not need to act clever because they already acted wisely. That is a very different aesthetic. And I think it is the correct one. I should also say something about leaving money to children and grandchildren, because older people often use that motive to justify taking risks they do not need. They tell themselves they are staying aggressive for the family, that a bigger inheritance requires more growth, that safety is somehow selfish because it might produce less. I think that is often backward. The greatest gift you can give your family is not forcing them to rescue you because your portfolio structure betrayed you at the worst possible time. Financial independence in old age is a gift to children. The parent who takes foolish risk and later requires assistance is not making an abstract allocation choice. He is potentially shifting emotional and financial burden onto the next generation. Leave what you can. But first, do not become a burden unnecessarily. That is part of love too. Another objection I hear is that inflation makes these conservative structures unsafe. Again, that is a confusion of categories. Cash alone held forever may indeed lose purchasing power. Long-term fixed nominal claims can be poor inflation hedges, but short-term treasuries reset relatively quickly, and the stock sleeve provides the long-run growth engine. The answer to inflation at 70 is not to turn the whole portfolio into a growth experiment. It is to combine immediate stability with long-range productive ownership. That is why the three-part structure works. People also ask about annuities, real estate, high-yield bond funds, preferreds, master limited partnerships, and all the other things that sales culture loves putting in front of retirees. Some of these can have narrow uses. Some may suit particular tax or estate circumstances, but when I ask whether they meet my 3 tests of principal safety, income reliability, and immediate accessible liquidity, they often fail. They fail on lockups, they fail on market risk, they fail on business quality dependence. They fail on rate sensitivity, they fail on transparency. Too many people buy them because the check looks attractive or the pitch sounds official. I do not want attractive checks. I want durable ones. Durability is the whole subject. That is what old age teaches if you listen well enough. Not everything that pays is safe. Not everything that guarantees is accessible. Not everything that sounds conservative is actually built for peaceful living. This is why I keep returning to simplicity. If a structure is too hard to explain cleanly, it is often too hard to trust during pressure. Pressure reveals whether you understood what you owned. The retiree should not have to reread the prospectus during a hospital stay. He should already know the roles. Safe short. Term government paper, broad equity growth, real cash. That is enough complexity for a civilized old age. The market will always try to sell you more. The advisor will always be tempted to complicate what should be plain. The culture will always try to make modesty feel unsophisticated. Ignore all of it. Your job at 70 is not to impress anybody. Your job is to protect the life you earned. If you can do that while still participating intelligently in the long-term growth of great American business, wonderful. If you can do it while keeping 1 or 2 years of real liquidity available, even better. If you can do it while sleeping soundly and not checking the market in fear every afternoon, then I would say you have already found something very close to the right answer. That is what I would want. Not maximum return, maximum peace consistent with lasting purchasing power. That is the true goal. And if you structure the portfolio around that goal, the decisions become much easier. The treasuries are there to hold the floor. The index fund is there to preserve growth over time. The cash is there to make sure nothing urgent disturbs the whole design. Put those pieces together, size them. Honestly respect your own temperament and stop letting younger men's risk appetites masquerade as universal wisdom. You are not in the same game they are, and that is perfectly fine. You already played the accumulation game. You do not have to win it twice. Now, the game is protection, dignity, flexibility, and enough growth that the rest of life does not feel financially brittle. I think these three investments do that better than the complicated alternatives people keep trying to sell. That is why, if I were over 70 and responsible for every dollar of my own lifetime savings, this is where I would begin, and I would not apologize for the simplicity of it. Simplicity is often what remains after wisdom stops trying to look interesting.